This lecture is the second in the series on the role of government in a market economy. If you'll recall, in the previous lecture, we asked the question, if a laissez-faire market system works so well, as we have indicated in the past in all of the readings and the previous lecture notes, and if the government is so inefficient, as indicated in the essay entitled Introduction to Capitalism, and in chapter 5 in the textbook entitled Public Goods, Public Choice, and Government Failure, why then would we want government intervention into a market economy? Well, what we saw was that there are two valid reasons. One set of reasons would be the positive justifications for government, which is what we're going to deal with today. But let's quickly review the other justifications, the so-called normative justifications. As you know, the positive justifications deal with what is. That is, when the market fails to produce an efficient outcome. This is also known as market failure. There are some cases where the market fails and the government can actually do a better job. So in those cases, we let government do it. But before we get into that, let's revisit the normative justifications of government that deal with what should be. Now, the normative justifications exist when the market produces an efficient but undesirable outcome. And the outcome can be undesirable when it produces too much poverty. Now, it produces too much poverty because you'll recall an efficient market system will result in an individual's income being equal to his productive contribution to society. Now, this is efficient, although not necessarily the best. It is the efficient way of distributing income because it motivates individuals to make the greatest possible productive contribution. But some people who can't or don't make a productive contribution, they get no income. And allowing them to suffer in poverty and starve, that is beyond our social norms, hence the term normative justifications. So what we do, we make the people who do not make a sufficient productive contribution to society, we make their situation better by redistributing income through the tax system. The problem, though, is that when we redistribute income through the tax system, it causes the economy to become less efficient. It diminishes the incentive to make a productive contribution. It increases the incentive to rely on government rather than making the most of yourself and producing wealth for yourself. And it also results in a misallocation of resources. So there's a trade-off between economic equity and economic efficiency. We can achieve more economic equity, but to do so, we must sacrifice economic efficiency. And when we sacrifice economic efficiency, the standard of living for the society goes down. Now, what we saw is this continuum here, where we see the various economic ideologies. The equity efficiency trade-off. Over here on the right, we see that we get perfect economic efficiency. Income is distributed according to one's productive contribution to society. Now, we know that this is not desirable because, as we saw, it produces too much poverty. But on the other extreme, we get total economic equity. Everybody is guaranteed an equal income. Now, that's not desirable either. Why? Because nobody would produce any wealth. Why would you do that when you're not going to gain by doing it? You're not going to lose by not doing it. So you take the easy way out. That is the perfectly rational way of doing it. So wealth doesn't get produced. Over here, when we get total income equity, everybody's income is equal, but we are all equally poor. And this is the way it is in Venezuela now. Their incomes are equal, but they are all equally impoverished as a result of guaranteeing total income equity. Now, where would you like to be along this continuum? Where would you like society to be? How large a sacrifice in living standards is the society willing to make in order to achieve greater economic equity? Now, they want more economic equity. Not only is it morally superior, but also a great difference in the distribution of income can fill the society with unrest. We're seeing a lot of that today. Now, so how much of a sacrifice in standard of living are you willing to make in order to achieve more economic equity? How great a sacrifice in the standard of living is society willing to make in order to achieve more economic equity? Well, society decides that through the voting system. Virtually that might be a reach, most bills that come to Congress deal with the distribution of wealth and deal with this equity efficiency trade-off. But what we want to deal with are the positive justifications for government intervention into a market system. The positive justifications work from the failure of free markets to produce an efficient outcome. As gloriously as I spoke about how wonderful the market system is, it turns out it's not perfect. There are flaws in the market system, and in some cases, the market fails to produce an efficient outcome. Now, not even the staunchest libertarians, now you'll recall a libertarian is a guy who's way over on the right, much more conservative than a conservative, is not willing to sacrifice much in the way of standard of living in order to achieve greater economic equity. You'll notice the root word of libertarian there is liberty, so they want minimum interference by government, but not even the staunchest libertarian would object to these interventions by government because he or she recognizes the fact that in some cases the market fails to produce an efficient outcome. And even as inefficient as it may be, the government may be able to do a better job. So even the libertarian would say, okay, let's let the government do it. Now, one of these issues, one of the positive justifications of government would be define and defend property rights. Now, private property, as you know, is a mainstay of a capitalist system. It means two things. It means you get to keep what you have produced, and which of course is what motivates us to produce, because we get to keep it, we're producing for ourselves. And it also means that individuals, rather than the government, owns the resources. Now, strong property rights are essential to the effective functioning of a capitalist economy. Now, by strong property rights, I mean property rights that are well-defined and well-defended. As you know, when people are free to do what they want, their main goal is to acquire ever greater amounts of material wealth for themselves. And there are many ways to acquire it. If property rights are weak, people will spend their time trying to acquire wealth for themselves by taking it from you, by lying or cheating or stealing. Now, if I'm going to buy something from you, I've got to be pretty darn sure that it's yours to sell, and that after I buy it, it will belong to me. Whether it's a piece of land or a car or a widget. I'm not going to want someone coming up to me the next day and saying, hey, that's actually mine. The other guy had no right to sell it. It didn't belong to him. Now, I certainly wouldn't want that to happen. And if I'm not sure that it's yours, I might be reluctant to buy it from you. And trading, as you know, buying and selling, is what permits us to specialize in the production of tradable wealth rather than having to produce everything we want for ourselves. This is what makes us so productive. If I had to produce everything I wanted for myself, I'd be impoverished. Instead, I spend my time specializing in what I do best and trading it away for what I really want. I specialize in the production of tradable wealth. This is not possible in a world without trade, and a world without strong property rights will be a world without trade. Now, when property rights are well defined and well defended, the most reliable way for people to acquire material wealth is to produce it themselves, because they are unable to take it from you. As a result, people will spend all of their time and all of their energy producing wealth rather than trying to steal it. Now, there are various ways in which the government can define and defend property rights. They define and defend property rights through the legislative and the judicial branches of government. Here's Congress, here's the Supreme Court. But there are other layers of courts as well who also defend and define property rights. Here, as you can see, the police are protecting this person's store right here. They're defending his property rights. Now, why the government rather than the private sector must provide police protection will be talk about next. So the first thing that the government must do is to define and defend property rights. A second positive justification for government intervention into the market is to provide public goods. Provide public goods. Now, a public good is one with a unique set of characteristics that makes it impossible for the private market to provide it. Therefore, it must be provided by government. In other words, the private market cannot produce and provide and supply for society one unit. The market system is incapable of providing one unit of these items that we will call public goods. Now, I have to inform you that not all goods provided by government are public goods, as the term is being used in this context. A public school, for example, is a good that is provided by government. That's why we call it a public school. It's provided by the public sector. But a public school is not a public good as we will define it in this context. Now, let's look at this Venn diagram here. You can see that everything in that circle are goods that are provided by government. But these things that we will call public goods are just a subset of the goods that are provided by government. Public goods, they must be provided by government, but a good that is provided by government is not necessarily a public good. Now, what are these characteristics of a public good? Now, when both of these characteristics are present, they would prevent the production of a good being profitable. And as a result, the private sector won't produce it, won't supply it because it's not profitable. If these two characteristic features exist, first, a feature called non-rivalry. Non-rivalry. Now, what that means is that the consumption of a good by me does not reduce the amount of that good that is available for you. We are not rivals in the consumption of this good. When I go and buy a gallon of milk from the grocery store, that's one less gallon of milk that is available for you. But if I consume a unit of a public good, because it is non-rival, that does not reduce the amount of that good that is available for you to consume. So this characteristic, and this is very microeconomic oriented rather than macro, so we won't get too deeply into this. But in this case, the marginal or incremental cost of providing this good to an additional consumer is zero. Essentially, the good is available in infinite supply. And such a large supply, of course, would result in a zero price. That wouldn't be good for the firm now, would it? No, of course not. Now, the other characteristic feature of a public good is one that is non-exclusive. Non-exclusive. That means it is too costly or even impossible to prevent non-payers from consuming the product. It's not exclusive to the person that buys it because it is too costly or impossible to prevent non-payers from consuming the product. If I buy a gallon of milk from the grocery store, that gallon of milk is exclusive to me. You can't consume any of it unless, of course, I give you permission. But without permission, you can't consume any of it. It is exclusive to me. However, this non-exclusive feature means that it would be impossible for me to prevent you from consuming that milk. It would be impossible. And this is the reason why it's called a public good. Once I buy it, it's available to the whole darn public because I cannot exclude them from consuming the product. As a result, with a public good, consumers will not purchase the product themselves. Instead, they will wait for somebody else to purchase it, and then they will free ride on their purchase. Now, the term free ride means enjoying the benefits of a product paid for by someone else. You cannot enjoy the benefits of that gallon of milk I buy from the grocery store, but if a product is non-exclusive, then you can, and I can't prevent you from doing it. So what am I going to do? Am I going to buy it myself? No, sir. I'm going to wait for somebody else to buy it, and I'm going to get to consume it for free. Now, a good example of a public good is national defense. You'll notice that the government provides national defense. Now, it doesn't necessarily produce that helicopter right there. That helicopter is probably produced by Boeing or McDonnell Douglas or something like that. The government must purchase this from the private sector to provide national defense, which is a public good. If national defense were provided by a private sector firm, and let us say that Acme National Defense Company is providing our national defense, and the purpose of national defense is to prevent ISIS from coming over to the United States and chopping off our heads. That's kind of an anachronistic example. It's the only one I can think of right now. If that's the purpose of national defense, then Acme National Defense Company is going to provide it, and it's going to need a $10,000 check from each of us. So each of us dutifully gets out our checkbooks and starts writing a $10,000 check to Acme National Defense Company, but I don't. Everybody's writing out their check, and I'm just sitting there. And you're saying, hey, aren't you going to get out your checkbook and write a check? I say, no, sir. They say, why not? Why, are you unpatriotic? I say, no, I'm not unpatriotic. I'm just rational. And that is because if I do not write them a check, does that mean that ISIS is going to come over here and pluck me out of society and chop my head off? No, I get to benefit from the national defense that you are purchasing. So why should I purchase it? I get to benefit from it for free. National defense, you'll recall, is non-exclusive. And you say to yourself, well, what the heck am I paying for it for? I can just free ride off the next guy. So everybody's trying to free ride off each other. Who's going to ultimately wind up buying it? Nobody. There is, however, an entity that can force you to pay your fair share, and that, of course, is government. Here's some other public goods: public parks, street lighting, drainage system, police protection. Now, here's an interesting example: police protection. you will notice that there are some private sector police forces. There's Jeanette's, there's Pinkerton's, and there's a whole variety of rent-a-cop agencies. These are private police services. Now, why do they exist? If police protection is a public good. Well, I was walking down the streets of Washington, D.C. just one day last week, and I was marveling about how safe the streets are. I can just wander around even in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'm very, very confident that I will be safe, that I will be protected by the District of Columbia police force. Nothing will happen to me. But you know what? I don't pay 1 cent of taxes. I do not pay 1 cent of taxes to the District of Columbia. I mean, I pay federal taxes, of course, where the federal government is located in Washington, D.C., but to the Metropolitan District of Columbia, the city, I don't pay 1 cent of taxes, but yet I can benefit from the police protection just like everybody else can. And that is because the police are not going to come over and say, let me see your receipt, your tax receipt, before I defend you. Or if, if somebody's going to come along and mug me and steal from me, they're not going to check to see if I paid, taxes. So I cannot be singled out because I don't pay taxes. And therefore, that's why police protection is a public good. But if police protection is a public good, why are there private police forces? Well, here's the reason. The private policing agencies provide extra protection. And this extra protection can be excluded from non-paying individuals. Basic police protection, safe streets, cannot be excluded from non-paying individuals, but the extra protection can. And since the extra protection can be excluded, it can be provided by the private sector. Now, there is a third positive justification for government. And as you can see, that would be reallocate resources. What? Reallocate resources? What the heck is up with that? I thought the market economy did a great job of allocating resources. As a matter of fact, in the essay Market Efficiencies, we see that the market system does a perfect job of allocating resources. It achieves what we call allocated efficiency. Why does the government need to step in and reallocate resources? Well, there is one case where resources are not allocated efficiently. Actually, there's more than one, but let's focus on this one particular case where resources are not allocated efficiently. And that's in the case of something called externalities. Now, there's a word you can use at your next cocktail party, externalities. What are externalities? Externalities are costs or benefits associated with the production or consumption of a good or service that spills over to some third party, where a third party is someone other than the original buyer or seller. Now, you'll notice that I highlighted the term spills over because sometimes these externalities are called spillover effects. Spillover effects. Now, the presence of these spillover effects cause resources to be misallocated and thus will require the government to step in to reallocate them. Now, let me give you an example of an externality. Here's the consumer of widgets and the producer of widgets, okay? These are the first two parties. The consumer buys the widget, the producer makes the widget and sells it. So these are the first two parties. I don't know which is first, which is second, doesn't matter. But now here's a third party. He doesn't have anything to do with either the buying or selling, the consumption or production of a widget. Nothing. He's just some guy standing around. But yet, let us suppose that when the firm produces the widget, that it causes pollution to occur, and that pollution affects this guy. This guy here who is consuming the widget, maybe he dumps litter on the ground, or creates an ugly mess because he doesn't throw it away or something like that, the waste product. So anyway, for whatever reason, this third party here is somehow affected by either the consumption or production of a widget. He's bearing some of the burden, some of the cost of either producing or consuming a widget. The cost of producing or the cost of consuming is spilling over to that third party. Now, that's an example of an externality. The root word of externality, of course, is external. So here's a cost or benefit that is external to these two parties right here. Now, there are two types of externalities. There's a negative externality or a spillover cost, which we just saw in the previous slide, or there are positive externalities or spillover benefits. Now, let me just give it away. Cut to the chase, as it were. A negative externality is going to result in too many units of the resource guided into the industry by the price mechanism. The negative externality is going to result in an over allocation of resources guided into the industry to produce widgets or whatever product we're talking about. On the other hand, a positive externality will result in an under allocation of resources guided into the industry. Goods that produce positive externalities are sometimes known as merit goods, M-E-R-I-T, as in meritorious. They produce spillover benefits. They are so socially meritorious that if left to the private market, not enough would be produced. That is to say, there would be an under allocation of resources guided into the industry. So a negative externality left untreated by government would result in an over allocation of resources. A positive externality untreated would result in an under allocation of resources. Now, let's look at some examples of negative externalities. As we saw, there's air pollution, that makes us all miserable and it increases the global warming. There's pollution from fertilizers. This can filter down and be dumped ultimately into the Chesapeake Bay and kill the fish and cause the food to be poisonous and adverse to our health. There's industrial waste. It causes all kinds of crap. I don't know. There's noise pollution. There's the collapsing fishing stock. Look at all those poor fish. Good God Almighty. All of these people are fishing and they're overfishing, and they're not, all the fish are gone from the ocean. Not really, but there's a lot fewer fish, and fish play an important role in the bio relationship, whatever it is, I don't know. And look at this cow farting right here. That's producing these CO2 emissions, methane emissions, that's causing this global warming. All of these, that's from the production of steak. And you and I, even if we don't eat steak, we are suffering from the production of steak because of that. So let's see how a negative externality will misallocate resources. Here's our good friend, the supply and demand curve, and we see that we're in the widget market, we are achieving allocative efficiency because we know that equilibrium in the widget market will produce an efficient allocation of resources. That right there represents just the right amount of resources guided into the widget industry. That quantity of widgets being produced is just the right amount. Now, if you're wondering why, let me suggest you go back and read the portion on allocative efficiency in the essay entitled Market Efficiencies in the course content lecture notes section, Market Efficiencies. So there we have allocative efficiency, but let's suppose that there's some sort of negative externality associated with the production of widgets. Okay, who knows what it is? Pollution or something like that. Who knows what it is? See, there's a widget factory right there that's producing widgets. Look at all the industrial waste, all of the pollution. Actually, this is a picture of a utility and that's steam coming out, so don't let that scare you. That's water vapor. It looks like some hellscape, but that's not as bad as it looks. Anyway, so let's assume that that is pollution right there. And here is the Smith's dream house. These people have been waiting and saving and saving and saving and investing and sacrificing and saving so that they can ultimately build their dream house. And there it is. They live in their dream house now, and oh, the world is so wonderful. But the problem is that when this firm produces widgets, and see, the Smiths, they don't have anything to do with either the production or consumption of widgets. This factory is producing widgets. This pollution then is going up in the sky and coming down on this household right here in the form of acid rain and whatever it is. So here is the producer of widgets, here is the consumer, and here is the third party. Watch what happens to the third party. Look at that. Oh my goodness gracious. Look what happened to that house. All as a result of pollution. Now, these people didn't have anything to do with the production or consumption of widgets. They were just, third party bystanders. But they had to bear the cost, some of the cost anyway, of widget production. You can see that they had to bear the cost. The production of widgets has imposed a cost on this third party right here. There are the types of costs. Medical bills, imagine what all that pollution does to their lungs. They have to repaint their house. What happened to their value of their house, the equity in the house, the real estate value? Well, it went down. So these people were really suffering here from the production of widgets, even though they had nothing whatsoever to do with the production of widgets. Those were the third parties, and they were feeling the negative externality, the spillover cost. Now, back to the supply and demand curves, let's analyze the effects of this negative externality on the efficiency with which resources are allocated. So let's put a subscript NX there on that supply curve, meaning that there is a negative externality associated with supplying widgets. Negative externality associated with supplying widgets. Well, the question arises, is Q1, Q sub 1, still the optimal, most efficient level of output for the widget industry? Well, what do you think? Of course, the answer is going to be no. Why? Well, let's imagine that we could internalize this negative externality. Internalize. That means that to take all of these costs that have spilled over to third parties and bring them home, make the firm realize it, make the firm itself bear the cost of all of this iniquities that have heretofore been imposed on third parties. Let's internalize these externalities, make the firm aware of all costs, make them feel the costs, make the firm bear all costs of production. course, that would cause the firm's costs to go up. The firm is escaping some of those costs because he's transferring those to third parties. But now his production costs are going to go up. And when his production costs go up, the supply curve for widgets is going to shift to the left. Now there's the supply curve of widgets shifting to the left. Now you will notice that on this supply curve right here, let me go back one. You'll notice on this supply curve right here, there's no NX. There's no externalities whatsoever. Why? Because these externalities have been internalized. Now, how have they been internalized? Well, you know, this is a model. So we can say we internalize them by waving our magic wand and poof, all of the externalities are internalized. You can't do that in real life, of course. There's no magic wand, but fortunately we can in this model. So we waved our magic wand and suddenly all of the externalities have been internalized. So there is the new supply curve for the firm, no externalities. It lies to the left of the old supply curve because the firm's production costs have gone up. It is no longer escaping the production costs that it had imposed on third parties. So here is the supply with no externalities. Here is the demand with no externalities. So there is the new, most efficient, optimal allocation of resources guided into the widget industry. That right there is just the right amount, Q sub 2, just the right amount of widgets to produce. Not too many, not too few, just the right amount. But look, without the government intervening, you can see Q sub 1 would be the amount that the market produced. Q sub 1 is the amount the market produces. Q sub 2 is the optimal amount. That's the amount that produces allocative efficiency. As you can see, without the government stepping in, then there would be too many widgets produced. Q1 is the natural outcome of a free market. It indicates too many widgets because Q sub 2 is the optimal amount. As you can see, this negative externality resulted in an over allocation of resources guided into the industry because the firm was able to transfer some of the production costs onto third parties. And of course, the result was that the production of widgets was artificially high. They were artificially enthusiastic about production, which resulted in the over allocation. But you'll notice here that the third positive justification for government was not internalize externalities. It was reallocate resources. And that's because it's not always possible to internalize externalities. There are no magic wands. Or it may be possible, but not desirable to internalize externalities. You may not even be able to define externalities, the extent or the cost. And the production of some kind of goods like energy would be too costly without some pollution of the atmosphere. So even though it may not actually be possible to internalize externalities, it may be possible to simulate the internalizing of externalities by reallocating resources in such a way as to reflect a market with no externalities. Now, to do this, the government can use three branches of government. It can use the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. Now, the judicial branch, of course, is the courts. If a victimized third party can show the degree to which he was damaged and can prove who it was that damaged him, the victim can use the courts to sue the perpetrator. And if the verdict is efficient, then it will require the firm to compensate the victim for damages to the precise extent of the damages, no more, no less. Now, the legislative branch can pass laws that would impose fines and taxes when a firm pollutes. In other words, it can force the firm to purchase from the society the right to pollute the atmosphere. In this way, you still get the pollution, but at least the firm now bears the cost of polluting, and the supply of whatever product he's producing reflects this. And this will result in a better, more efficient allocation of resources. Like the government imposes a tax on tobacco companies for the production of cigarettes. The government imposes a fertilizer tax on fertilizer companies, forcing them to purchase from society the rights to pollute the environment, the rights to pollute the Chesapeake Bay. Well, the government can use that, of course, to clean it up. But the point is that can use those tax receipts, but the point is that the cost of polluting the Chesapeake Bay is borne by the firm doing the polluting, and that will be reflected in the supply curve. And the executive branch, of course, is the president's cabinet, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and other branches, executive branches and cabinets and things like this. These are the guys that are tasked with enforcing the laws. Now, Congress passes the laws, but how strictly and how powerfully are these laws enforced? That's up to the executive branch. Does the firm get a little leeway? How much? Well, that's up to the executive branch. Now, let's look at the case of positive externalities. Positive externalities. Here are some examples of positive externalities. Now, you see this beekeeper right here? He's producing honey for a profit. But as a result, he's propagating the species of honeybees, which is beneficial for the environment. He's not doing that for the benefit of environment. He's doing it for a profit. But he's somehow benefiting the environment. These benefits are spilling over to the rest of us. Okay, we just happen to be innocent stand-buyers, and we are getting the benefits of what this guy is doing right here, although he's doing it strictly for profit. Vaccinations, like vaccination against the COVID. Why would you get vaccinated against the COVID? That is to protect yourself from COVID. But as it turns out, when you get vaccinated from COVID, the chances of you spreading it is diminished. And so the rest of society benefits from you getting vaccinated from COVID. But why do you buy it? You buy it for your own protection. You don't buy it from society, but society benefits. That's a spillover benefit to society. And here is another very good example, education. There are spillover benefits associated with the consumption of education services. That's what you're doing right now. You are consuming education services. And you are doing it for the benefit of yourself. You're doing it to invest in your developing your skills and knowledge and information that will permit you to make a greater productive contribution to society. But as it turns out, your consumption of these education services are going to spill over to the rest of society. As a matter of fact, the cost of educating you in the state of Maryland, your cost, your tuition and everything only covers about a third of the total cost of educating you. It doesn't cover the whole cost. Why are the taxpayers of Maryland willing to pick up the other 2/3? It's because they benefit. They get positive externalities from you educating yourself. So let's look at equilibrium in the widget market, in the education market. I'm so used to saying widgets. So here's the supply of education services with no externalities. Here's the demand with no externalities. And here is the optimal quantity. Supply and demand is going to produce the most efficient quantity, most efficient allocation of resources. But will equilibrium in the education market produce an efficient allocation of resources in reality? No, because there is, excuse me, spillover benefits associated with the consumption of education services, spillover benefits. So what we're going to do, we're going to put a little subscript PX there by the demand curve. That PX will stand for positive externalities. There's positive externalities associated with the consumption of education services. An educated person will benefit society because they're less likely to commit a crime. They will wind up paying more in taxes. They're less likely to wind up on welfare or unemployment. They are more likely to make a major contribution to society, like the cure for cancer, and they will become a more informed voter. Society benefits from all of these, but you're not buying education services for the benefit of society. You're buying them from yourself. You don't recognize the benefits that are spill over to society. So society benefits from your consumption of education services, of which you are either unaware or indifferent or both. And so the benefits that accrue to society have no effect, no influence in your decision as to whether or not to purchase education services and how much. None whatsoever. But what would happen if we were to internalize these externalities? Now, what do I mean by internalize? That means that you yourself would capture all of the benefits that spilled over to society from you getting educated. Now, you're going to capture all of the private benefits. You're going to, have more skills, more knowledge. You're going to get a higher salary. You're going to capture all of those benefits. But what if somehow we could wave our magic wand and suddenly you are now feeling the effect of all the benefits that had heretofore spilled over to the rest of society? What would happen to your delight in consuming education services? Well, I dare say it would go up. And if it did, what would happen to your demand for education services? Well, it would go up too. And the demand curve would, of course, shift. Your demand curve would shift to the right. If the consumer of education services were somehow able to capture for himself all the benefits that had up to now spilled over to the rest of society, his demand curve would shift to the right. So now we have supply with no externalities. We have demand with no externalities. Here is the equilibrium quantity that is produced with the supply and demand with no externalities. There is the optimal amount produced. But without the government stepping in and waving their magic wand and internalizing these resources, here's the amount that would be produced right there. You can see that that represents an under allocation of resources guided into the education industry. Q2 is the optimal amount. Q1 is the amount that would be produced in the private market. In the unfettered market, that would represent an underallocation. Now, not surprisingly, if a negative externality results in an overallocation of resources guided into the industry, stands to reason that a positive externality would result in an underallocation of resources guided into the industry. Now, what can government do to increase the amount of resources guided into the industry? They can't wave their magic wand. They don't have one. They can't internalize the externalities. How are you going to capture the benefits of you becoming educated that you are bestowing on the rest of society for yourself? I don't know if you can do that. So one way is to implement policies that will shift the demand curve for education services to the right. Now, that won't internalize the externalities, but that will simulate what will happen to the allocation of resources if externalities were internalized. So how is the government going to shift the demand curve for education services to the right? It can do so with subsidies, low interest loans, scholarships, fellowships, etc. All of those things would motivate an individual to purchase more education services. Or the government can shift Q sub 1 out here to Q sub 2 by shifting the supply curve rather than the demand curve. And this is why the government provides tuition-free public primary and secondary schools. Tuition-free. Now, that doesn't mean they are free. Somebody's got to pay. They're free to you if you have a kid going to school, but they're not free to society. And the government also provides low tuition state and community colleges. Prince George's Community College, University of Maryland. University of Maryland is expensive, but nowhere like Stanford or Duke or Harvard or something like that. And so this is the government's attempt to shift Q sub 1 out to Q sub 2 so as to correct for this under allocation of resources. Now, before I go on, we just have a few of these left. Let's deal with the fact that you'll notice here we call education public and public primary and secondary schools, a public school. Why is a school not a public good? It's produced by government. Yeah, it's produced by the public sector, but it's not produced by a public good because it is possible to exclude non-paying individuals. If you were sitting in my classroom, hypothetically, on the first day of class, I'm supposed to check your pink slip, your receipt, to make sure that you paid for this class. And if you don't have it, I kick you out. Now it is, so you can see then, and if you don't leave, then I'll call security. As you can see then, it is possible for me to exclude non-paying individuals from enjoying the benefits of my lecture. Now, I don't, in fact, really do that because who's going to sit in an economics lecture, you know, just for entertainment purposes? Well, I dare say not many. So, a public school is not a public good, but the government needs to provide public schools because it's their way of shifting the amount of resources guided into education. Education is a merit good. If left to the private market, not enough would be produced. Let's consider the next positive justification for government intervention into a market system, and we'll call this paternalism. Paternalism. Now, the word pater, P-A-T-E-R in Latin, means father. And so the term paternalism means acting as a father. Now, is the government justified in acting as a father? If so, when? Well, the reasoning is that the government is justified in acting paternalistically if it can make better decisions for you than you can make for yourself. You're probably saying to yourself, what? Under no conditions can the government make better decisions for me than I can make for myself. But there are actually two situations where the government can make better decisions for you than you can make for yourself. Number one is when you lack information. And secondly, when people are tempted to make irrational decisions. Now, let's first consider the lack of information. Sometimes it's too costly or even impossible to obtain enough information to make a rational decision. One example, of course, is medicines. You can't make a rational decision about medicine. You get a cold, you say, well, what medicine do I need? I don't know. Let me go run out and get a PhD in chemistry real quick and figure that out. Well, no, you don't need to do that. You don't need to know how one medicine interacts with the other, because you'll need a prescription, that's permission from Pater, to purchase this medicine or that medicine or something like that. The doctor, of course, is the intermediary. You can't look at a package of food and see what's in it. You know, you can't tell how much sugar is in it, how many glutens are in it, what this or that. The same with electrical or other potentially dangerous devices. It's hard to, the information is not readily available. It's not obvious. So in such cases, the government either provides you with the information or requires the producer to provide you with information, as in the case of those labels on food, or it regulates your behavior, prevents you from doing this or prevents you from doing that. Now, in the case of prescription drugs, it regulates your behavior. In the case of most food products, it requires that the producer provide the information about the fat, the calories, cholesterol, etc., and allows you to make your own decision. Did you know that it is illegal to produce cribs with slats more than 4.5 inches apart? If you try to produce a crib that has slats more than 4.5 inches apart, buddy, you're going to jail. And you deserve it too. Why? It was probably not obvious to you, as it was not obvious to many crib producers up until the early 1960s. But it was discovered that the slats are too far apart, that a baby's head will get stuck in the slats. If you'll notice, a baby's head is much larger in proportion to its body than an adult. An adult's head is much smaller in proportion to its body. A baby's head is much larger in proportion. So what can happen is the baby's flopping around in the crib. He gets his body through the slats there, but his head doesn't fit. And what happens? Of course, he hangs himself, or suffocates or something like that. Who would know? So the government regulates that behavior on the part of the producer. It also prevents you from taking drugs that will cause you to become addicted and go out and steal in order to get the appropriate funds to buy it, etc. So the government will provide you with information or regulate your behavior. Okay. Now, the second one, the individuals are tempted to behave irrationally. Now, this is the case with seat belts and motorcycle helmets. I mean, when you figure the benefit, the probability of being killed in a car wreck because you don't have your seatbelt on is extremely low. It's probably less than, I don't know, 1 in a million, maybe. Let's suppose it's 1 in a million. It's probably higher than that, but let's suppose it's 1 in a million. You say, well, that's virtually zero. I'm not even going to bother to buckle my seatbelt. 1 in a million. It's not going to happen to me. And my guess is that it's not going to happen to you. But how many millions of car rides are there per day? It's going to happen to somebody, and that's why 20 or 30 people a day die because they didn't have their seatbelt buckled. Now, they felt the same way. The probability of this happening to me is so slim, it's virtually zero. Virtually zero, but not absolutely zero. It's probably not going to happen to you, but it's going to happen 30 or 40 times a day. And so the government then, because you are tempted to confuse 1 in a million with zero, forces you to buckle your seatbelt or wear a motorcycle helmet. So, how does the government act paternalistically? It regulates your behavior or provides you with information. Now notice the spectrum here. See this continuum? We've seen this before when we were talking about the normative justifications for government. Over here on the left, this is where the liberals are. Over here on the right, this is where the conservatives are. Over here on the left, the liberals would be more likely to have your activities regulated, laws that force you to buckle your seatbelt, to wear a motorcycle helmet, to force, determine what drugs you are able to take, and for smoking indoors. Over here on the right, there's also a negative externality there. On the right over here, the government provides information, food, over-the-counter drugs, electrical appliances, cigarettes. You see that little label on a pack of cigarettes that says it's not good for pregnant women or something, may cause cancer or whatever it is. So here the government is making choices for you. Here the government provides you with information and lets you make your own choice. Now over here, recall on the right, these are the conservatives. Over here on the left, liberals. Where would the issue of face masks belong in this continuum? The conservatives tend to say, let the government provide us with information and we can make our own decision as to whether or not we want to wear face masks. The liberals would say, I think the government should force everybody to wear face masks. Where are you along this continuum? Well, now, we only have two more. The fifth one is to maintain competition. The fifth positive justification for government intervention into the market is to maintain competition. In general, it's competition rather than the iron fist of government that regulates the behavior of firms in the market. It's competition, not the government. The competition provides consumers with alternatives. And these alternatives force the firm to provide quality products at a price that consumers are willing to pay. And if they don't do that, the consumers will just buy from the next guy. That's the idea about competition providing alternatives. But remember, the goal of the firm is not to produce goods and services for the household. The goal of the firm is to produce profits for the firm's owner or owners. That's the goal, to provide profits. So keep in mind that it produces goods and services and acts in this socially beneficial way as a byproduct, as a result of a byproduct of the owner's own self-interest. And therefore, if the firm could eliminate competition, it would, because this would shift the power from the consumer to the firm. The firm then would be able to dictate what price the consumer would pay rather than the other way around if there was no competition. So the firm doesn't like competition. And so it's totally rational to eliminate competition, and we should actually expect the firm to make a conscious effort to eliminate competition. So what can a firm do to eliminate competition within its industry? Well, it can eliminate other firms entirely through mergers, that is buying them up, acquisitions, buying up their stock, predatory pricing, that is pricing their products so low that the other firm has to charge a low price as well. And the guy that can take losses for the longest is the guy that emerges as the winner, and the monopoly. So you can get rid of competition that way. A predator is someone who goes out to kill someone, and predatory pricing means you're pricing your product with the intent of wiping the other guy out of business. And also by establishing barriers to entry into the industry. That would prevent new firms from entering the industry and competing with you, the firms that are already there. Now, it can also eliminate firms through superior management, better products, and being more efficient. Now, this is the more organic and much preferred way for a firm to eliminate competition. This motivates them to act in a socially beneficial way. And it explains why Amazon and Walmart have put many mom and pop firms out of business. They're more efficient. But there's another factor that tends to reduce competition within an industry, and that is technological progress. Now, here's the automobile industry in the 1900s. Actually, in the 1900s, there was over 100 automobile firms, 100 firms producing automobiles. Can you believe that? More than 100, well, more than 100. I didn't want to take the time to put 100 of these dots here. But so what happens? Between 1900 and World War I, along comes a rudimentary, primitive version of the assembly line. Now, some of these firms invested in the assembly line. They took their profits and rather than take them home and spend them, they invested in the assembly line, and some did not. Now, the firms that invested in the assembly line became more efficient. Their production costs went down because they became more efficient, and therefore they could charge a lower price than these guys over here. These guys over here remained inefficient and couldn't charge that lower a price. And so what happened? The customers bought from the guys with the lowest price. The guys that charged the highest price, they couldn't sell any. They went out of business. These guys got their customers. And so there became fewer firms in the automobile industry, but look, they were also larger. Why? Because now they have a larger customer base and they're producing more. And the assembly line leads to mass production anyway. So here's the automobile industry after World War II. The same thing happened. Now comes the electronic assembly line. Much more electronics, much more sophisticated technology. That stuff is expensive. Some of these firms decided to invest in that. Some of these decided not to. Those that decided to invest in this, they were now able to produce cars more efficiently. The cost of production went down. They could sell their cars at a lower price than these guys here. And so these guys here who had to charge the higher price, they went out of business. These guys got their customers. And so as a result, there were fewer firms in the automobile industry. And look, they were also larger. So here's what the automobile industry looks like today. There are three really gigantic ones. These are the domestic automobile companies. Of course, there's Japan and Germany as well. But these are the three major ones in the United States. Look how big they are and look how few they are. Same thing happened. These guys got so big and so efficient by robots. Some of those other companies didn't employ the robots. Those that did were able to sell their product cheaper, and they had a better product too, I might add. Those that didn't had to charge the high price. They couldn't keep up with the competition. They went out of business, and so these guys get their customers. There are fewer automobile firms. Notice how larger they are. Now notice I keep saying they sell at a lower price. Back in 1925, a good Model T Ford cost about $800. Today, a good car might cost $40,000. What's so cheap about that? Well, when you consider the fact that today it takes an average household less time to earn $40,000 than it did in 1925 for a household to earn $800. By that standard, cars today are cheaper in real terms, not in nominal terms. In real terms, cars today are cheaper because it takes less time for an average person to earn $40,000 than it did in 1925 for an average person to earn $800. So what does the government do to diminish the tendency of competition to reduce, whether it's by technology or whether it's by a conscious effort on the part of the firms? Well, this is what it does with its body of antitrust laws. Now, antitrust laws, that's covered in microeconomics. The first antitrust law was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And this right here was Standard Oil. That octopus right there, Standard Oil, started going out and acquiring all of these firms. Not only as suppliers, but also other firms in the same industry. And it was using this power to charge extremely high prices. Well, the government, through the Sherman Antitrust Act, broke up Standard Oil into 33 different companies. Since then, all kinds of legislation has been designed to reduce the conscious and sometimes natural reduction of the level of competition in markets. So it's important that we maintain competition. There is a tendency for competition to diminish over time for a variety of reasons, and it's up to the government to maintain competition. And generally, this is done through the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Now, we have one more, hang in there, we have one more positive justification for government intervention into the market system, and that is to smooth out the business cycle, to smooth out the business cycle. Now, the business cycle is fluctuations in the level of economic activity that are caused by change in total spending. Spending by the household, by the government, by the firm, and by foreigners. All of this aggregate amount of spending will go up and down and up and down. And so if we chart this out over time, look at the GDP, the gross domestic product, we haven't gotten there yet, but you'll learn what that is in short order. But this is the most general indicator of the level of economic activity. Over time, the GDP looks like this. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. Over time, it goes up, however. But look at these sharp spikes in the GDP. We would much rather the GDP look like this. Look how much smoother it is. Why would we like the GDP to look like that? Because it makes a nicer looking chart? Well, no. It's because when the economy spikes up too much like this, we get an undesirable macroeconomic phenomenon known as inflation. Now, I'm not even going to attempt to describe to you what inflation is or why we don't like it. But just take it as a leap of faith. This is not good. Or if the economy spikes down like this too much, we get unemployment because the economy is going too slow. We get a recession. We don't like either of those. And so the government steps in to help smooth out the business cycle so as to diminish the impact of inflation and unemployment. Now, the policy tools available to the government for doing this are fiscal policy. Notice this is fiscal, not physical policies, fiscal policy, which is government taxing and spending. And this is what you hear about with budgetary surpluses, budgetary deficits, balanced budgets, trillion-dollar deficits, stuff like that. We hear about that all the time on the news. And the other policy tool available is the monetary policy, which is about how the government influences interest rates. And they do this through the Federal Reserve System. Notice I have Fed there highlighted because oftentimes the Federal Reserve System is affectionately referred to as the Fed. So, in conclusion, in summary, there are two categories of justification for government intervention into the market. There are the normative justifications, which is about redistributing income. And then there are the positive justifications, which result from market failures, market inefficiencies. So that ends this lecture. If you have questions or comments about this, be sure to post them to the discussion board.